My name is Jean Bethke Elstein, and I have been asked to chair this session, and I'm quite happy to do so. Happens to be the case that I have three friends lined up here who will be presenting this morning. You have their biographies, their accomplishments listed in the program, so in the interest of time, I will not go over those, but let me give you the order of presentation and the titles of the papers. The first paper will be by John Langan, and the title I have, and I hope these are correct, is A Good End and a Good Close. This will be followed by James Turner Johnson. His topic is A More Perfect Peace, the Ideas of Use Post-Bellum for the 21st Century. And then we turn to Robert Royal, In My End is My Beginning. So what we will do is begin immediately with John Langan, and I will simply stay out of it, save to hold up menacing notes if people start to go over the time, because we do have three paper givers present, so we want to get everything in.
How long do we each?
Well, Eric Patterson suggested a very abstemious schedule, which was something like 12 minutes for papers. I might extend that just a bit, but we should try to stay around 15 minutes if possible. I think, given that we have three paper givers, I know how difficult it is because that means your presentations are rather schematic, but let's try so we can maximize the time for discussion. And with that, John, if you would take over.
Thank you very much. I started this paper with a comparison between wars and basketball games that we, but I will spare you the details of that, some of which are of mainly local interest here at Georgetown. Wars, of course, are vastly more important and more complex than basketball games. One interesting dissimilarity between the two activities is that the basketball game has an ending, which is determined by the clock and not by the score, with the obvious exception of a tie game, which then goes into overtime. What happens after the clock runs out no longer counts as part of the game. States and armies normally have to decide when a war is over, whether it is won or lost, and they have to take certain steps which count as ending the war. These vary considerably with military, legal, and diplomatic context, and they may be more or less formal and explicit. It is worth keeping in mind also two simple grammatical points. First, the verb end can be either transitive or intransitive, that is, the war ends, or leaders or soldiers decide to end the war. Second, the notion of ending has an inherently negative element to it. What ends or is ended is no longer the case. It is not what is now true. It is completed and is no longer developing or changing. It is finished. But it is not necessarily over and done with. The basketball game goes into the season record, partially determines championships and tournament eligibility, has more or less far-reaching effects. It is not simply over and done with. It continues in memory among both participants and observers, and in various forms of record, it becomes, as we say, part of history. But there are other kinds of negativity which quickly become evident when we talk about ending war. There's the negativity of death and destruction, the negativity of conflict and struggle, the negativity of adversarial relationships and harsh emotions, which are experienced by participants and described and intensified by both participants and observers. There is, in short, the negativity of the horrors of war, as these have been depicted by painters and photographers. But beyond the negativity of certain kinds of deeds, there is the further negativity in our assessments of war, the accusing conscience, the lamenting memory, the vehement moral judgment, the tormenting feelings of guilt and shame. When all these negativities are brought together, it's a simple step to conclude that ending war is a task to be done as quickly as possible. That is, regardless of the manner in which it is done. It is a task of such urgency that the modes and qualities of its execution are niceties of no great moment in comparison with the moral imperative of ending the war, whether it is this particular war or war in general. This position involves a way of thinking and feeling about war which we commonly call pacifism. The central thesis of pacifism as a doctrine is that no war is morally justifiable. It's comparatively easy to establish that many wars are not morally justifiable or acceptable, and it's also easy to argue in general terms that peace brings numerous benefits to humanity and to particular societies. But pacifism, as a theoretical position, goes beyond an endorsement of peace and criticisms of particular wars. It makes a universal claim which leads to conclusions which give rise to objections all across the political spectrum. It causes distress to both traditionalists and revolutionaries. Its central thesis need not be taken to apply to all forms of violence. Some pacifists can accept the necessity of violence in police activity. But if its central thesis is true, there can be no reason, no cause, no goal which provides adequate moral justification for the waging of war or for the continuation of war. Or to put the matter compactly, there is no end which justifies war. Here we should note that end is being used not to indicate a boundary or a cessation of activity, but a goal toward which activity is directed, the sense of end or telos that we find in Aristotle and Aquinas, which directing violence to the achievement of a goal is a form of rational activity, the pursuit of a good. For a pacifist, almost any way of avoiding or stopping war is preferable to war itself, since war is such a large and uncontrolled evil. Some ways may be better than others, but the focus for pacifists is in the first instance the halting of hostilities, the end to the violent clash of arms. But pacifists can have a positive political agenda of their own, which may range from anarchism to global confederation. They should not be accused of favoring the worst imaginable consequences of adopting pacifism, but they can be legitimately criticized for increasing the likelihood of some of those consequences. Now, in what follows, I'll be working with the typology derived from the book of A.J. Coates, The Ethics of War, where he talks about images of war. I'd prefer to call these perspectives on war. And the other, which I call these other ways of thinking about war in our philosophical and religious traditions, they conceive the end of the telos in somewhat different ways. And with regard to what happens, to what is the desired outcome in the post-war situation. In militarism, the use of force and the waging of war is seen as a valuable contribution to the protection of the common good or the national security. In contemporary democratic societies, militarism can involve deference to the views of the military on the proper use of force, but it need not and should not involve authoritarian or totalitarian political views, even though it would be short-sighted to ignore that that's been the case in the past. The end internal to the activity of waging war is victory. On the level of those who conduct military operations, the task which confronts them in prevailing over the enemy. This has normally gone with control of the contested territory, destruction of the opposing army, and ending of violent resistance from the opponents. This is the kind of outcome cherished in American memories of the end of World War II, which we have called VE and VJ. The end of the war in the Pacific was marked with special clarity by the signing of the Instrument of Surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. This was unconditional surrender, which was necessary because Japan was thoroughly beaten in military terms and had only horrendous alternatives to contemplate, and which was possible because the Japanese regime still had enough coherence to make an effective decision for the great bulk of its forces to lay down their arms. One common feature of wars which end in victory is that the final victory is usually the culmination of many previous victories in battle. This is unlikely to be the pattern when the war is conceived and fought as a loose series of engagements. While the end of the war against Japan was profoundly satisfying for Americans, it does not constitute a paradigm which is readily transferable to other conflicts. The end of World War I was a much more jagged series of events involving an armistice, the collapse of hostile governments, widespread episodes of revolutionary violence in Central and Eastern Europe. Contemporary guerrilla wars are not concluded in such a tidy fashion. Victory can be attained in such wars, but its concrete signs and elements have to be reconceived in ways appropriate to the context and to the realities on the ground, which are only imperfectly understood by all the participants. But failure to get close to the main features of the World War II paradigm, even when the major political objectives have been attained, is likely to leave many in the military forces and many of their friends in the political world seriously dissatisfied. This was, I think, the case for the United States after the Korean War. This set a pattern in which responsibility for less than fully satisfactory outcomes was put on the political leadership and the media and on a failure of commitment by the civilian population. Very true, I think, in Vietnam. For many who take the business of war very seriously, there is no substitute for victory. This is an attitude which can often be joined with a rejection of political and social complexity and with a variety of challenges to the principle of civilian control of the military. There is an obvious sweetness and satisfaction in the attainment of victory. There is a clarity in the relationship of means to the unique end and an accompanying blindness to what does not fit the paradigm. The moral worth of a war seen from within the perspective of militarism is found in the exercise of the military virtues by all ranks and the defense of the national territory and security from threats posed by the opposing side. Thus, war evokes a moral commitment which justifies putting one's life at risk and bearing the sacrifices which military units have to make. I'll move on from militarism to holy war, which puts enormous weight on the goal of winning the war and is less inclined to put restrictions on the means with which the goal is pursued. In a holy war approach, there are large and powerful superhuman actors, either God, in the case of the monotheistic religions, or various Olympian gods and goddesses, as in the Iliad, or forces of light and darkness, as in Manichaean and dualistic systems, or the great forces of history and nature, as in secular systems of thought such as Marxism and Darwinism. Ending a holy war well will mean bringing the war to its conclusion in alignment with the true God or the dominant forces of history in the ascendant. The opposite side is to be deprived of power, eliminated or even annihilated. Justice and purification are achieved in the aftermath of the victory of the good or the divine side. The goal is the sort of comprehensive victory which enables the victors to rearrange the social and political setting in such a way that the good will prevail for the indefinite future and that the evil will be appropriately and permanently punished. This is the sort of scenario which can be realized in varying degrees and with different forms of religious explicitness. As I use the notion of holy war here, I'm thinking of something which can be found in clearly religious terms, like the medieval crusades, or some forms of jihad, or the Qumran literature, or in the extension of secular ideologies. Holy wars are ordinarily fought by religious actors for religious reasons in obedience to religious authorities. A given war may exhibit some of the characteristics of holy war and may at the same time exhibit characteristics of just war or of a realistic approach to war. In fact, I would argue that World War II, as seen from the United States, falls into all three categories. A just war, successfully concluded, is one which meets the requirements laid down in the just war tradition. It requires moderation in the use of force, insists on the continuing humanity and human rights of the adversary, and requires serious reasons to justify the use of force. It does not require that the just side achieve a complete and durable victory. Addressing the just causes which justify the war in the first place can be achieved through a negotiated peace between equals. But the minimal conditions which need to be met if a war is to be ended well is that the just cause which provoked the war in the first place must cease to define the policy of the initial belligerents, that the victory of one side is not seen to be the result of serious violations of jus in bello, and that the terms of peace be seen by both sides as broadly reasonable and just, and that there be no intent to resume the conflict at some point in the near future. An example of a war ending which failed to meet these conditions was World War I. And I think it's very difficult, actually, to come up with positive examples. Perhaps the end of the Cold War, with the unification of Germany and the end of communist expansion in Europe, is the closest we've been able to come. Even if a war has been substantially just in its conception and execution, as the Iraq War in '91, the process of terminating it was messy, inconclusive, and by general agreement, not well done. Realism is another way of approaching this whole problem, and this focuses on the interests of the state as the primary source of justifications for war. We're not going to think about realism just as a denial of the relevance of all moral considerations, which would terminate our enterprise very quickly. The outcome in Korea in '53, I think, shows a situation in which the initial aggression of North Korea was repelled. The regime in North Korea has not become rational or just over the last 50 years, and it still represents a threat to its people, to its neighbors and its own people. But the outcome is sufficiently stable to allow the remarkable economic development of South Korea. State interests were effectively advanced, at least from our standpoint. Realism accepts the historical patterns of conflict and tolerates lesser evils. And that makes it possible to regard the '53 armistice as a durable and positive outcome, though marred by numerous flaws. Realism is likely to be the best view for accommodating the possibility that war may show a radical disconnection between its origins and its outcome, and for what one might call the ironies of the whole process. Realists will, realism is, of course, also more likely to be drawn into calculation of comparative outcomes with a strongly utilitarian cast to that process. There are two warnings that I'd like to, and two confusions that I'd like to at least mention in concluding. We are, I think, too inclined to move from the classification of ways of justifying the use of force, which is what these 5 positions that I've been discussing are about, to thinking that they provide a classification of wars as they are actually lived and fought and concluded. Precisely because wars are such large, comprehensive, and peremptory projects in modern societies, participants in wars are likely to have complex and not altogether consistent attitudes to them, both as they occur and as they are remembered. We should not be surprised to find that many participants in a war combine elements from different conceptions of what constitutes a good end. Public debate, which is not aimed clearly at either systematic consistency or personal integrity, is likely to grasp at various ways of motivating ordinary citizens and participants in the war. Ending the sufferings of war, achieving and celebrating victory, eliminating evil, resolving the issues in a just way, protecting and advancing the vital interests of the state, are all likely to be perceived as overlapping and hopefully as mutually supportive objectives. To which of these we give primacy when the situation forces certain options will depend on which of the great perspectives on war we regard as the most adequate, as well as on our judgments about what can be achieved in the situation.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much. We will next turn directly to James Turner Johnson's paper on a more perfect peace, use post bellum for the 21st century. Jim?
Thanks, Jean, and thanks to Eric and the others involved in the organization of this, and to Georgetown University. It's always a pleasure to come back here and see what new buildings have gone up since the last time I was here, as the playing field dwindles farther and farther. At any rate, I was given the brief, a brief that fundamentally boiled down to 2 issues. One is the whole question of what post-conflict responsibility is, and the other is, does something have to be done to the just war idea in order to make for this? Let me address the latter question first. I have for many years, ever since the term jus post bellum and other Latin or almost Latin terms that have been offered to refer to this have come along, I haven't really been a fan of them. And one reason I haven't been a fan of them is that historically, the people who first began to put them out were people who were opposed to the idea of just war in the first place. So this was their way of saying, well, since there aren't any just wars unless you fight them justly, and since nobody fights them justly, let's turn to the matter of responsibility after conflict, and this gives us another way of saying that there aren't any such things as just wars because you can't ever get anybody that finishes them up right. I think that the situation has changed a bit, and I'm not as critical of this usage as I was even 5 years ago. But I still approach it with a certain amount of skepticism. This for several reasons. One is that it seems to me that the idea of just war is, we ought not to think of the idea of just war in terms of these historical categories of jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and now jus post bellum. The historic term, bellum justum, just war, didn't include these. In fact, the term jus in bello didn't come along until somewhat later and was grafted into it. And the idea of jus ad bellum is actually a legal term, not a moral term, that gets added in after the beginning of the modern period, when the whole just war tradition was in the process of being remade into a fundamental framework for a law of nations. For those of us that don't know much Latin and think that, oh, they're talking about jus, so it must have to do with justice. No, it had to do with law. The jus ad bellum was the law having to do with going to war. The jus in bello was the law having to do with the fighting of war, the law of war, in other words. And so jus post bellum would, on this model, have to do with the law of what you do after the war. And you know, I would say, well, okay, we've already got that in a sense, already in Grotius, certainly, in his comments on post limine. But obviously, the people that wanted to talk about jus post bellum were really wanting to talk about moral concerns after war, and I'm on board with that. So again, I've backed off from my opposition to the term. I'm a little skeptical still. Another concern we have to keep in mind is that the idea of just war today is not one idea, but a lot of ideas. Virtually everybody that writes on the subject, it seems, has his own notion of what the idea of just war is. The philosophers break down into Kantians and utilitarians. You have the whole enterprise that has grown out of Michael Walzer. Mostly, I think, people that don't know what Michael Walzer was talking about, but nonetheless, they find their roots there. People that want to look back to Augustine, people like me that want to look back at the classic just war tradition, and people that have found other ways of defining the idea of just war also. For this reason, I think that we need to be somewhat careful when we talk about how to define the idea of just war so as to include concern for responsibility after conflict. And to some degree, it always will depend on which version of just war we begin with. Now, my own predilections in recent years have been to go back ad fontes, go back to the beginnings, to the sources, to say, okay, what was the idea of just war when it first came together in the 12th and 13th centuries, and work forward from that. And the answer is that it was a conception that was closely calibrated to the three ends of politics as understood by Augustine and, of course, by late classical thinking before him, order, justice, and peace. So that if you, for example, read Aquinas on the idea of just war, bellum justum, you have sovereign authority as the first requirement, which correlates with the good, political good of order. You have just cause, which correlates with the end of justice, and you have right intention, which correlates with the end of peace. Right there, in a nutshell, is the whole picture for Aquinas. And it is the whole picture in a very real sense for trying to understand what the whole enterprise of just war thinking is about fundamentally, as I would want to describe it. And this includes a real concern for the aftermath of conflict. Just war tradition is not really about whether violence is right or wrong as such. It is about the use of violence by particular parties, persons who have the responsibility for the common good, for the purpose of establishing or maintaining an order in which justice exists and therefore peace is served. And so the resort to force has to do with establishing a just peace. I was thinking as the presentations were given this morning that in terms of the fundamentals, we're going to have a heck of a lot of consensus today. But of course, the devil is in the details. And so I pass on to the second thing. That is, what's it going to look like? And there, it seems to me that, that it's important to realize that there is not, the question of right and wrong or justice and injustice in the use of armed force is not simply a moral issue. It also is something which has to do very much with the nature of the historical circumstances in which conflict comes into being and with the practice of war, what is possible, what is thought to be right, and how war is in fact practiced. Up until the era of the wars of religion in the post-Reformation period, there was a fairly close correlation between what was possible in war and what it was thought to be right in war. There was no real benefit in totally despoiling the countryside because after the war was over, you'd have to live there. And indeed, during the war, you had to depend on the people in the countryside to provide you with the ability to keep on going. At the end of the fighting period, you would go home and see to your own lands and your own crops and your own, the justice of the little piece of society that you were responsible for. And so there was a significant inner motivation in the circumstances of war in the pre-modern period, which tended to make for a concern for not having a Carthaginian peace at the end of the war. This changed for a period of about 100 years in the era of the wars of religion, but then after the Peace of Westphalia, we have put in place a framework which attempts to provide that there not be any more such ideological wars, such all-out wars. And this works for a while. This works all through the 18th century, and it's only in the Napoleonic period that it breaks down again, when you have the eruption of the idea of the nation in arms, which leads in turn to the idea that war guilt is somehow or other associated with an entire population. And this, I think, reaches a kind of climax in the Peace of Versailles after World War I, when these enormously heavy punitive reparations were imposed on the losing powers with the result of social disorder and eventually the result of World War II. We still are, in many ways, the unwitting recipients of the unwitting heirs of the thinking that is associated with that kind of war, unfortunately. And so when we have a different kind of war, such as has really been the face of war, most wars since World War II, a lot of contemporary thinking has not been able to make the transition very well. We need to do that, and we need to do it in such a way that we take the old theories, the old principles, but we find what the new applications for these can be. I think of the question of jus post bellum in terms of differing kinds of responsibilities. There are clearly responsibilities for anything that one does. That's just plain common sense morality, if you will. If I do something, then I'm responsible for the outcome. But at the same time, there are other factors that affect the nature of that responsibility or the degree to which I can be held to account for my responsibility in it. Circumstances may differ. If other people are involved, that brings a different dimension to bear, and so on. In the case of thinking about responsibility after conflict, responsibility for the restoration of society, responsibility for the reestablishment of peace, it seems to me that you have responsibilities, first of all, within your own society, secondly, to the other party or parties within the conflict, thirdly, to the general framework within which both of you have to live. And all of these kinds of responsibilities need to be taken very seriously, so that it seems to me wrong-headed to suggest somehow that only the United States or only the most wealthy power in a conflict be charged with the entire responsibility for what happens after it's all over. There is a certain common sense element to this as well. We know, for example, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, for that matter, that the responsibility, whatever responsibility the United States may want to shoulder for the peaceful state of society there, is challenged by the desire to take up responsibility for their own fate by the Iraqis. And this somehow or other has to be balanced. We have the same kind of a situation in Afghanistan, and more generally, it seems to me, this is characteristic of much of contemporary conflict. The problem of dealing with an entity like Al-Qaeda and the underlying basis in Islamic radicalism that fuels it ideologically creates a whole different sort of concerns. What are your responsibilities there? How do you establish peace at the end of a conflict such as this? The answers are not entirely unilateral. The answers have to do with forging a relationship in which both the parties in the conflict can participate in creating a society which will allow them to move forward with in terms of a common framework of justice and peace. And it may, in fact, it certainly is very elusive to do this, but it may, in fact, not be possible to do that. Let me now conclude with just a couple more comments. Something very important happened at the dawn of the modern period, which first Francisco de Vitoria and then Hugo Grotius phrased in terms that I have given my own term to: simultaneous ostensible justice. That is, the idea that in a particular conflict, it may in fact be the case that as far as the parties to the conflict are concerned, they both have justice on their sides. God may know different. Some of us may think we know different, but nonetheless, in real terms, there are people on both sides of the conflict who can claim the cause of justice to a very important degree. The benefit of this is that you then have to regard the other guy, the enemy, as having rights that you might otherwise be inclined to deny to him. If the other guy is in the wrong, then he has no rights. But if the other guy is somebody who also thinks he's fighting on behalf of justice, then he does have certain rights. And this has implications for how you fight the war. It also has implications for how you live in the aftermath of the war. Regarding responsibility after conflict, thinking about this and the moral and material reasons for this, isn't to specify then a specific set of rules. In fact, if jus post bellum does have the legal meaning of particular rules, I would suggest these have to be very, very broad and open to a variety of implications, because circumstances after war is over necessarily are extremely complex. I think it was Bismarck who commented that you want to avoid war if for no other reason than in war things happen that you can't control. And that's also the case after a war is over. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third paper by Robert Royal, In My End Is My Beginning.
Well, I want to thank Eric Peterson and the Center for putting together this timely conversation. I also want to apologize on his behalf for putting the three of us on the same panel, because I anticipated in advance. We've been on podiums together before that we were largely going to agree on a number of issues, particularly this last point that James made about the need to, if jus post bellum is going to mean some legal requirements, they need to be defined very carefully. But I tried to anticipate some of what they were going to say, and I hope you'll bear with me as I try to just sort out maybe a few other reflections in addition to what they've already said. When I started to think about this subject, I was reminded of a visit my wife and I made on July 4th, 2008, to a World War I cemetery outside of Bayeux in France. And I was very struck by this. It was a beautiful sunny day because there was an inscription over the monument where the graves were below this monument, saying in Latin something like this, if I remember it correctly: "To the fallen conquered, to the fallen conquered, who liberated their conquerors from conquest." Now, this Zen-like saying actually has I realized actually has a very clear meaning. What it meant was, because you're near Bayeux, where the conquest of England is recorded in the famous tapestry, of course, this is a monument to the English, the conquered, by the ancestors of the French, who have fallen liberating the conquered French from their conquerors, the Germans. I'm sorry to start with this complex beginning, but it's worth beginning in complexity with this, because all these considerations I think are wrapped up in this one image. Now, whether the French put this up with, I think would be a little gauche, because they called the British conquered, or the British put it up, I don't know, and it's one of the rules of peacekeeping in a marriage that you don't linger too long at battlefield monuments like this with your wife. She might not be interested in them. But as I experienced this, I said, oh, that's wonderful. France and England put aside this entire history. Forget that Napoleon, Waterloo, all that stuff, We're on the same page. But of course, lurking in the background, as the other panelists have already said, is the result, which was not conclusive and leads on, in some respects, in the normal way we think about these conflicts, to World War II. But actually, as I reflected on this further, I don't know if that's exactly right. Is it the case that these paradigms, World War I and World War II, that we kind of use broadly to talk about just war categories, really are the way they've been, are truly what they are normally thought to have been? Because if you look at the armistice after World War I, why was it so troubled? Well, because, of course, there wasn't a military defeat in the sense of the occupation of Germany as there was after World War II. The victorious powers were barely victorious, and scholars, of course, debate what this means as they debate everything else, and had different ends. The French wanted a punitive set of reparations, which they, by the way, had suffered themselves after the Franco-Prussian War. The British were worried about ongoing economic relations with Germany, and the United States introduced sort of an idealistic element. And if I'm not mistaken, parts of the Charter of the League of Nations are actually embedded within the Versailles Treaty, which is something very few people know about. So this got me reflecting about what do you do in a troubled situation, even like World War I, when at least what people hope to achieve by this very imperfect and internationally brokered and therefore complex settlement, what they're hoping to achieve is several other things, but at least inhibiting Germany sufficiently so that it won't go back to war. Of course, it didn't work. And we like to take the World War II experience, where there was the invasion, there was the US tutelage, the Marshall Plan, all those things that we all applaud, as kind of a paradigm for what a good end to a war might be. But even there, I mean, the argument could be made about World War II, it seems to me, that if the Soviet threat were lacking, would America have been quite as energetic in protecting and helping to rebuild Europe, Western Europe primarily? I don't know. There's also an element that's been mentioned in some of the other papers in the resolution of World War II that, again, is very little known, and that is that the Christian Democrats, mostly Konrad Adenauer and Robert Schuman in France, Adenauer in Germany, Schuman in France, naturally, conducted some very low-level discussions after that war when Germany was a pariah, and were able to get a conversation going that led to various organizations that now have turned into the European Union. Whatever you think about the European Union, and there's much, of course, to be said about it, at least it resolved that old Franco-German conflict to the point that, of course, we know that today it's very unlikely that there could be a land war on the European continent. So that of course, is why we take that as a paradigm. But I want to add a third element to this, kind of bad example of entering a war and good example of ending a war. And maybe you'll already anticipate where I'm going with this, because I think those two other ways of thinking about the two world wars are simplified versions that we all learned in high school, because you have to get a kind of a simplified narrative for younger students just so they can make sense of these very complex situations. I picked this title from T.S. Eliot, In My Beginning is My End, which is from the Four Quartets, because I really believe that insofar as you can identify principles that would govern a post-bellum situation, I wouldn't call it a jus post-bellum, but a post-bellum situation, they have to extend from the beginning of the conflict, the initial aims of the conflict, with all the contextualization that the full just war theory gives to the way you think about what the end of that conflict is, after the end as well. So in my beginning is my end. Yes, we know what we want as a conclusion of the war, at least in broad terms. And also, I mean, Eliot also has this line later in that same poem, in my end is my beginning. So that there's a second element that I want to emphasize, that yes, we can identify some legitimate concerns about what happens, that there's a kind of a beginning at the end as well in a paradoxical way. But I would emphasize, as my colleagues have, that these principles would have to be very broad. I think that, I think of a phrase of G.K. Chesterton's in this context. Chesterton once said that if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Now, he doesn't mean by this, that we aim at mediocrity or we aim at incompleteness, but it's sort of the nature of warfare that we cannot know the end with any degree of confidence at the beginning, and even still less, because it's further down the road, we cannot know what the post-bellum responsibilities may be. We can aim at certain ideals, but we cannot know exactly what they may be, because we may have to undertake a war without hope, that seemingly has no hope of satisfying very many of those post-bellum desiderata, I would call it. And you can even take an example like World War II. If you think about it now, if you tried to place World War II in the category of reasonable chance of success from the just war categories, well, how reasonable is it to invade the European continent against the Nazi totalitarianism with the hope of succeeding, number one, and then doing what? If you do succeed in the narrow sense of military success. So It's true, I think, that in just war terms, a reasonable chance of success is relatively undeveloped compared to principles like just cause or right intention. But there may be a certain wisdom in this. As much as we're trying to specify a bit further past that military end, there may yet be a certain wisdom in this, because we may, in most instances, even in better instances than a lot of the ones we face right now, we may have to look at going into warfare and hoping that we'll be able to fulfill some of the things that ideally we would like to do. Now, my colleagues have talked about the circumstances, the specific circumstances now, and obviously Afghanistan and Iraq are a couple of such circumstances. I think both of those cases give us also large paradigms that we can look at without any conclusive lessons to be drawn from them. And I would use Iraq in this way, that whatever you think about the decision to go to war in Iraq, and of course there are all sorts of opinions about this, just as a thought experiment, let's assume that those weapons of mass destruction, which everybody, by the way, except a very few people, thought Saddam did have to some extent, even Hans Blix thought that before 2003. Suppose they were there. And then we could say, in retrospect, that the decision was perhaps justifiable, it removed a threat. We would still have had the same post-bellum difficulties that we have now. And as I've looked over some of this, I'm kind of a visiting fireman in this material, by the way, and maybe that's bad and maybe it's helpful, because I'm kind of trying to think through from the outside my own reaction to some of this post-bellum thought. It seems to me that one of the dangers in trying to set up too many ideals within this post-bellum reflection is that you start to create problems even for the things you can achieve. For example, we know that it would have probably been better had there been a larger number of troops and a greater intervention in Iraqi society at the beginning, because it would have probably prevented Iraqi citizens and maybe our own soldiers from dying in quite as large numbers. The surge, you could argue about the surge, but I think the surge kind of indicates in broad terms that that is the case. So by trying to be minimalist in those interventions, we actually may have created more problems for ourselves, and there may be a lesson in this. In Afghanistan, too, I think that we see that, that to invade Afghanistan is historically madness. Afghanistan has been the graveyard, as has often been said, of several empires, going back to the ancient Greeks and down to the Soviets. Was there another possibility? Were there so-called surgical strikes? Could we have lobbed drones toward the Al-Qaeda? I don't know. It seems implausible to me. But I think the Afghanistan case tells us about some of these more irregular, asymmetrical, non-state kind of situations, that we're going to be facing a number of challenges, it seems to me, that we know in advance are not going to be things that we can resolve very well. And maybe there's a lesson, or a kind of a lesson there as well. I latched onto a phrase of Michael Walzer's that I found very interesting. It's this idea of restoration plus, which means that when you have a war, what you're hoping to do is to naturally improve the situation and also restore many of the functions that were there before in a conquered nation. You want to have a functioning government, a legal system, police to protect people, an economic system, et cetera. And I think that that's a good beginning for reflections on post-bellum principles. But I think that the debate over what that plus is going to entail is where I begin to get off the bus, because I start to get very nervous. And I noticed, I'll read you just one, and by the way, this comes in an essay that is very, very sensitive and very, very, very good. This is one list of some of the things to be desired when you go into the post-bellum situation. These are the desirables, and I'm quoting. A healing mindset, just restoration, safeguards for the innocent, respect for the environment, post-bellum justice, the transition of warriors to non-military stances, and the study of the lessons of the war. Now, these are all good things. I mean, there's no one that can deny that these are good things to try to promote. But whether these will help or hinder the very difficult and gritty work that needs to be done going to war. I mean, if you think about environmental protection, for me, it's a little bit actually hard to imagine a commander callously disregarding callously attacking the environment when he's got an enemy that he's got to attack. But to think about it is not necessarily a bad thing. For me, though, the kinds of emerging principles, the kinds of criteria that you might use in a post-bellum situation, as I said before, go back to the beginning. If you're going to look at right intention after the war, of course, when you are, say, occupying a country, you do not shift from the attempt to do justice to a stance of domination, of colonization, of abuse of citizens. All of those things naturally were ruled out from the beginning, and I don't know how much it helps to think that we can set these things up as a set of post-bellum criteria. And I could go, I've gotten the 2-minute warning, as they say in sports, so I could go on and on. But let me just conclude. There are 3 things that I'd like to leave you with at the end of these reflections. And unfortunately, they're necessarily a little bit ragged and incoherent, and maybe in the discussion we can talk about these further. First, restoration plus is a good principle, as long as the plus does not become a kind of a perfectionist obstacle to doing the good that we can actually do. So the plus can, in fact, sometimes be quite minimal. A second thing, is restoration minus necessarily ruled out? Well, depending on what the minus is, I'm not so sure. We talk rather glibly about leaving a country in a situation of chaos, but most countries are in chaos more or less anyway, including our own at times, quite apparently. And there's chaos and there's chaos. We may want to distinguish between, is it possible sometimes to go in and leave some things more negative, but to have removed a threat that with the full moral seriousness that we can bring to bear on that situation, we still think it's worth doing. Finally, I sometimes detect in the literature on postbellum that I've read, and admittedly I have not read it all, there's almost a technological confidence in our own mastery over situations, as if we know how to establish justice systems or allow people to continue, with their own sovereignty, and you all can add to the list of the things that might come under that category. I think there's a certain concealed hubris in this. As we know quite well, there are situations in America right now in peacetime, situations of injustice and violence that we don't know how to solve. So I would just, as a closing note, again, inject some caution with also some hope and admiration for the people who are trying to think this thing through. Because at the end of the day, the end is going to have to be found in the beginning. And we're going to even make a difficult situation more complicated for ourselves if we're not very careful about deciding what we think that end ought to be. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to the admirable concision of our paper givers, we have a good bit of time for discussion. So let me just see if there are any inquiring minds that want to know. Yes, right there.
While you were speaking, I was thinking about the importance not just of winning a war, but of winning the peace. And of course, in the literature, in international relations, there is a lot regarding the so-called spoilers of peace. And this gets even more complicated when we think about contemporary conflicts, which besides being mostly internal, as has been said this morning, they tend to have overlapping areas also with issues such as organized crime, terrorism, etc. So I was thinking about the importance not only of winning the war, but of winning the peace and adjusting the political system that is somehow imposed, somehow mediated, but suggested on the country in conflict, the importance of choosing the most appropriate political system for the type of conflict that is taking place. So, for instance, choosing the proportional system rather than the majoritarian one, depending on the kind of democratization that is proposed, and also the different stabilization techniques that should be proposed depending on the type of conflicts. I would like to know your opinion on that. Thank you.
I have a hunch that all of our paper givers probably have something to say about that, about the complex question having to do with if winning the peace indeed involves helping to choose or put in place, as I understand your question, the most appropriate political system, in your words, for that particular place, that particular situation, if that's part of what's involved in winning the peace and use post bellum. So who would like to start with this, tackling this one? Otherwise, I will choose arbitrarily. Okay.
I'll venture one comment, which is that there's been a very significant change in the malleability of the population that you're trying, whose political institutions you're trying to transform. The broad divide is with the end of World War II and the collapse of Western imperialism. That the whole project of transforming the political institutions of another society, even while it was successfully carried out in Germany and Japan, was fundamentally undermined by the global spread of anti-imperialism. And the project is not going to have anything like so malleable a population as we encountered in Germany and Japan. And overall, I don't think there's any prospect of going back to something like that, what from an American perspective often looks like the perfect situation for us to be the benign transformers that we would like to think we were.
Anyone else want to tackle this? What about if you tweaked it a little bit and asked what responsibility, if any, a country that has invaded or intervened in a situation has for the kind of political system that emerges, not necessarily to impose one to core, but what responsibility do you have?
Well, one of the legacies of President Wilson and his effort to bring peace at the end of World War I was the idea that there ought to be effectively local decision-making, local determination of your political system. And in the immediate context, this amounted to the breaking up of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the creation of new states and so on. And we're still living with that legacy in a sense. The breakup of Yugoslavia, the breakup of Czechoslovakia, the breakup of the old Soviet Union are all fueled by this idea that we ought to have local populations, local nations in the European sense, able to make their own political decisions. Well, yes and no, I would say. Those of us who've ever read anything in the beginnings of modern politics know that there is this concept of virtue that's really a very pernicious concept, in that it means that not everybody really has the right to make his own decisions, or every population has the right to make their own decisions. They have to have a kind of ability to do so before they have that right. That's what virtue means in layman's terms. And And so it seems to me that the question you're asking can't be answered in a simple way. Some societies can be effectively left to their own decisions, their own outcomes. Other societies you have to wonder about. I would say that Afghanistan is a society like that. Do we really want the possibility of a return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan? Well, no. And that bears heavily on the question of our responsibility for continuing to bear the costs, human and financial, of being there, and to impose costs, admittedly, on the Afghan population. So I don't think there is a simple answer. My first response when you were asking your question was, oh, Lord. And maybe that's where I can end.
Bob.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question, and I think the Afghanistan case is it's very telling. Some of the people actually who I know who have fought in Afghanistan and have thought about Afghanistan think there might be possible ways to deal with at least elements in the Taliban and warlords. I don't know. It's such a complex situation. But it does put the most radical question to us, because what would be an appropriate political system for Afghanistan other than a coalition of warlords? I mean, what do we know historically about it? That's one problem. The second one that we've talked about, but maybe it's worth heightening this point a bit, is what do you do when you have intractable ideological elements within a population? Now, you know, after World War II, we had the will to denazify Germany, which was not as easy as it appears. I don't think we could do it today, by the way. I don't think we have the self-confidence in our culture to do it. The French botched what they called their épuration. I mean, it was a nasty, you know, back and forth, led by Jean-Paul Sartre, who thought that, you know, he had stood up to the Nazis during the occupation, which
Sitting in a cafe.
Yes, was very having his plays performed, his books, you know, published and whatnot. These are very difficult questions, even in the cases that we're quite familiar with. So, you know, what is an apposite system? I don't know that prior to the Korean War we would have thought that our having 30,000 troops sitting on the border with North Korea was a good idea for the last 50, 60 years, however long that it's been. So the question has to be asked, but like a lot of these, when you go to war, the presumption has got to be that, boy, an awful lot of other things have failed. So, you know, we try to do what we can, but you're right. I mean, the best configuration is desirable. It's just, what is that configuration?
Yes.
The way most of this has been described, you're talking as if in the jus post bellum, you actually have a winner, that someone has actually won the war and actually has some power to control the outcomes. I liked what Robert Royal said about, you know, the uncertainty with which you go into a war. Maybe the uncertainty in which we get out of a war is also something that needs to be considered. I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War and was convinced that we had to stay there because there would be a huge bloodbath when we left. There wasn't a huge bloodbath when we left. It was not pleasant, but it was nothing like what people had projected and suggested. So the uncertainty about going into a war and getting out of a war is an interesting way to look at it. But fundamentally, it seems to me the issue is, are you doing more damage staying, or are you doing more good staying in a war that seems to have no end? And how do maybe it's not jus post bellum that we ought to be talking about, but jus, I'm not sure the word, John can help me on this, ex bellum. I mean, getting out of getting out of a war. That is what we ought to be focusing on.
Jus ex bello, I guess. I'll venture one quick comment on this whole discussion, which is we now, we're roughly in a position of being told you have a license to perform surgery. The patient, however, declines anesthesia and declines to be disarmed.
Anyone else dare follow that?
I'm sorry if you thought that I was talking in terms of winners and losers, because I really don't think that's a very useful paradigm. When I talk of responsibility, I'm trying to shift the ground away from that. And it may very well be the case for all of us, in fact, up here, that in the end, the fundamental questions have to do with how you not only how the positive side of how you best contribute to post-bellum peace, post-conflict peace, but how you avoid doing more harm than necessary in the process of ending the phase of the conflict that you're involved in. Conflict, of course, may go on after you have ceased to be involved, which is another issue to look at.
Yeah, let me just add one further complexity, as if we don't have enough already. To talk about the United States in particular, because we bear a lot of responsibilities. In my paper, I talk about would it have been better if an international body was actually trying to manage the post-bellum situation in Iraq? It seems to me it would be worse. It might be something like the Treaty of Versailles. Who knows what this sort of thing would be. But for America, some of the things that we have to consider are, of course, where's the next emerging threat going to be? If we tie up 30,000 troops in South Korea and some 100,000 in Afghanistan and some residual force in Iraq and whatever else I've missed along the way, these major commitments, what have we got available if we're put on the spot to do something to prevent something terrible? Could be in the Middle East, could be almost anywhere in the world. So you balance these things off. Now, locally, South Korea looks great. Look at the way we're all driving South Korean cars and things now. I mean, they've done terrifically. But is that the best thing for the United States to do? Should there be other forces involved? I don't know. This has something to do with how you get out and whether it's whether it's overall a net good or a net evil. It seems to me.
I saw, yes, here.
Is it possible that the use... You're welcome. Is it possible that the discussion that started a few hours ago and continues here is an exercise in trying to outwit the future? I mean, we're not very good at that, yet that is a pillar of our Enlightenment politics and our Enlightenment philosophies. We can't outwit the future, and yet we try, but we try maybe with the wrong tools called reason and forecasting and clinical analysis and things like that. Maybe we need different kinds of methods.
Well, certainly the question of hubris has come up, has been mentioned, and I take it you're suggesting something similar, that there can be a kind of hubris involved in thinking we can predict precisely or forecast.
The gods aren't going to punish us.
Well, let's, but nonetheless, the general attitude that we have the power to, to control events, right?
Not control,
Predict events, which suggests a type of control. But at any rate, even if the gods don't punish us, that's presumably not a good thing. So does anyone want to comment on this?
Yeah, I do. I'm glad you said that, because it seems to me that there is an awful lot of that kind of thing going around in the debates. I like to make the point, and I in fact make the point in the paper, that when Augustine, in talking about the peace that ought to be the end of war, when he wrote about this, he talked about it not as pax, which is the peace you get in the city of God at the end of history, which is a gift of God. He talked about tranquillitas ordinis, the tranquility of order. And in fact, the issue here is to create an order within which justice can develop and peace can result. Now, you don't want to push that emphasis too far, because if you do, you find yourself knocking on the door of fascism. But I guess my chastened thinking about this whole business of responsibility after conflict has been being increasingly pushed back on the notion that maybe the best thing you can do is to establish some kind of sustainable order that is minimally just and leave it to the locals to figure out how to do better with that.
That's very wise, thank you.
If I could push a little further on this, I mean, in a sense, you raised the Yogi Berra problem. You know, the prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And I think you're pressing on an open door here, because I know my colleagues well over the years, and I think we're all more historians by temperament than economists, or people who like to churn out a lot of fairly detailed projections about how things will go. And we have, I think, modest expectations. One of the reasons why we got into some of the difficulties we did in Iraq, and this is a point that Bob touched on, it's not so much that we were minimalist as we thought we could achieve maximalist objectives with minimal inputs. And that's where we, you know, I mean, in a sense.
I didn't say that, by the way, that we were minimalists. I used minimalist in another
Okay,
context.
well then maybe we may be in greater harmony than I thought.
The Bush administration or something?
Yeah, well, yes, but anyway, okay.
Yes.
My question is about intentions in the decisions to go to war, and again, the decision after the war, and how do you achieve a just peace. And my question is, how likely is that to be? Because most wars are fought for the control of resources and markets. You may debate that, and I'd be happy to debate Mr. Royal on the reasons for the Afghan and Iraq wars. But just to give you a specific example, I was hired by the British government to advise the Iraq Minister of Electricity. And I discovered that there was a plan for virtually every Iraqi industry and how that would be either sold off or turned to the benefit of the American corporations and other Western corporations. So my question is basically, how likely is it that we will ever have intentions other than what is best for the powerful party?
I suspect that our panelists may have some questions about your assumption that most wars are fought for the control of resources, but let me not speak in their behalf. Anyone have any comments on this issue? I mean, certainly if one accepts your assumption, the conclusion that you offer follows. But it strikes me that if one challenges your assumption that most wars are fought for control of resources, then different possibilities open themselves up. So, John, you want to?
Well,
I'm not sure I guess he's about to accept your challenge. All right.
I'm thinking.
All right.
And it's a serious enough question that it shouldn't be answered right off the top of your head. But, you know, I can think of all kinds of wars that had nothing to do with resources. Was Vietnam about resources? It was World War II about resources? You know.
Well, and the other side of it is that sometimes concern for access to or control of resources can actually produce limitations. This was, as I was suggesting earlier in my presentation, this was very much one of the reasons why medieval warfare was fundamentally limited warfare, and so it's not a single-edged sword that we have here. If insofar as a particular conflict does have to do with access to resources or control thereof, this may also produce good things as well as bad things.
I think also that I would be against a stark opposition between a just war approach and a realist approach. I think if one works with that kind of opposition, then you always have a motivational problem. I mean, states will continue to act as states, and they'll be interested in promoting national interest and so on. The hope is that the gravity of the issues in war is so great that there will be some kind of conscientious reflection on the seriousness of the reasons. Not every contest over control of resources is inherently suspect. There can be justified claims to resources. Now, the fact that wars for control of resources were caught up in a certain dynamic with Western imperialism and so on, and this is certainly relevant to our own internal history in the relationship we had with the Native Americans. So there's reason to be suspicious, but not to move to instant condemnation.
Can I just add one thing here? In my paper, I quote a line from one of my favorite writers, Charles Péguy, who says that there's only one thing that has caused more wars than injustice, and it's the pursuit of justice. If you think about it, it's a pretty striking reversal. Look, you can have impeccable reasons for going to war. The Vatican has been talking about things like the right of humanitarian intervention, for example, lately, right? You know, a situation like Rwanda or, you know, any other, a number of imaginable places where horrors are going on, and you would have, you know, an immediate right to go in and try to do something, and maybe even a duty. But how often can states afford to do that? Well, they can't, because, you know, it damages their own resources, their own ability to respond to other things, and unfortunately, it's the kind of world that we live in. And I would add to what James said, it's quite often the case that the countries who think that they're going to go to war for the sake of resources actually damage themselves. So it's a complex, it happens. There's no question that it happens. But whether it's bad, whether it achieves what people think it's going to achieve, it seems to me it is questionable.
This just keeps building and building. The United Presbyterian Church in the U.S., in its general convention back in sometime in the late 90s, adopted, this was in the context of the debate over the use of armed force for humanitarian purposes, humanitarian intervention. And they adopted a resolution in which one of the points was that humanitarian intervention with military force could be allowed, provided that there was no economic benefit to be had from it. And I read this and I thought, my God, these guys have lost their minds. You're going to go to a democratic society and you're going to say, okay, we want you all to be prepared to bear the cost of this. This is a wonderfully altruistic, charitable thing to do, and you ought to do it, because we're telling you that. This is the Christian thing to do. Is that, in fact, how a society ought to function? Should a society, in fact, not be concerned about the welfare of its own citizens as a result of actions which are taken on behalf of that society, including the use of military force? I think in practice, it is not at all unreasonable to look at the possibility that there's going to be some kind of payoff. And it may not be an immediate payoff, like access to a particular resource like oil, or if somebody were to say, okay, we ought to go into the Congo because look at all those diamonds they got there. It might be a much more nuanced kind of positive result that has to do with lessening of tension in the region, the opening up of new avenues of trade, the freedom of individuals in that society to prosper intellectually and socially and contribute to the welfare of the world and all this kind of thing. So it just seems to me that the picture is not one where we need to look at it entirely in terms of black and white. It's also a very complicated picture.
I think we can sneak in one more before lunch, which is being assembled even as we speak. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to talk about the term occupying power and occupation law. And I wanted to get your thoughts with regard to this. I know that the United States, with the run-up to the war in Afghanistan and also the war in Iraq, resisted the term occupation, and as a result resisted occupation law. Instead, they preferred the term liberator. With that, perhaps semantic differentiation came a large difference in terms of how you approach the post-war. And so in looking at the term jus post bellum, is there then some sort of obligation on the part of the invading country or to put in some sort of law, and is it something that you've thought about?
Just occupation, or legal. Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, there is a branch of international law that has to do with that. And I think that the resistance to the term occupation was to avoid having the responsibilities imposed that are implied in that law. My whole approach to the idea of just war has been to think about the development of the moral tradition in dialogue with, on the one hand, military history, and on the other hand, the development of international law. I think international law on the whole has been a good thing. But on the other hand, I think it severely truncates the moral debate. And so I would like to have the moral debate running more freely in its own channels, and having the possibility of influencing international law rather than simply taking international law as saying what is right for all time and having it determine the terms of the debate for just war.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment, or no?
Well,
John, last final word.
I know there's a tension that's likely to be felt between the desire of the victors to preserve discretion in what they perceive to be in many ways a precarious situation. And so there'll be a certain aversion to regulation and so on. And it's right for us all to view that with suspicion, because if it's not somehow controlled, it becomes simply the imposition of a regime by force. And that's bound to be troubling in terms of, well, it's just incompatible with democratic legitimacy. On the other hand, some of these countries are extremely unstable, and there's strong humanitarian reasons for trying to rule with a quite firm hand. And you also have the question of what are you going to rule with politically? What kinds of allies, what kinds of coalitions, what kinds of local authorities are trustworthy, or if not trustworthy, at least less immediately unreliable than their competitors? This is a very difficult thing to look at from a distance, and also where nearly all the moral terms that get brought into the argument become contested and are subject to capture by the other side and redefinition and Orwellian manipulations of one sort or another. So it's a reminder of how difficult the whole thing is.
Thank you very much. We are about to adjourn for lunch, but let me just remind you that lunch is served in this room, which means we can be rather quick about it, and we will reconvene precisely, the program tells us, at 12:30. But let's show our appreciation to the panel.